afternoon, good day, wherever you are, wherever you're tuning in from. I'm here to talk to you about strategy and specifically what it takes to build a great one for your company or your product. I'm going to cover both of those. So first, why did I write this stuff down in the first place? Well, it started with a question that I got over and over and over again, and one that I found myself encountering at a lot of different companies that I worked for and with. And that question is, how do you handle multiple number one priorities at a company, especially when they are often at odds with each other? Typically, when we think about triaging priorities, we use something like an Eisenhower matrix. This is a very popular framework that just about every one of the SaaS planning tools out there have templates for. On the x-axis, you have urgency, and on the y-axis, you have importance. And you can bucket your work into these four quadrants with resulting actions. But what about when everything is important and urgent? This matrix is not going to save you. When you find yourself struggling with the question on the previous slide, when teams and priorities seem at odds with each other and everything is the number one priority, then you have a strategy problem. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I thought strategy was reserved for management consultants and people wielding PowerPoint decks. People like this guy. You would be wrong. Instead, this guy, me, is going to tell you why strategy should matter to you and what to do about it. So I'm Adam. Hello, product and growth advisor, a board member, the writer of the Fishman AF newsletter, and host of the Startup Dad podcast. And because the jokes and knee-high tube socks will probably give me away, I'm also a dad. Here are some of the companies that I have worked for or advised. Some of them have even been quite successful. I teach the Growth Series program at Reforge and have taught several other programs and created growth leadership for them. And if you haven't taken that program with me, you should. It starts again in January. But we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about strategy, specifically what it is and isn't, why strategy matters, how to craft a great strategy, and some case studies on both company and product strategy from some places that I worked. So let's get started. What is strategy and what isn't strategy? It is first and foremost how a company can create value for its customers and monetize that value consistently and over a long period of time. In other words, strategy is your plan to win. If landing on the moon is your vision, then building the ladder that gets you there is your strategy. But it won't always be right. In many ways, the decision-making you do as a company is like trying to solve the puzzle in Wheel of Fortune. You're looking at some unknowns, you're ready to guess, and the negotiations that happen between you and everyone else on your team is at what point do we feel comfortable trying to solve the puzzle? Every letter you pick is an experiment, a customer conversation, or some other input. And ideally, those inputs, which are the things that form your strategy, increase your certainty and decrease the risk that you're going in the right direction. Now, perhaps the most important part of strategy is explicitly laying out what you won't do. The more opinionated, the better. A good strategy at first will make some people uncomfortable, and that's because we're much more comfortable when we leave all of our options open. Don't do that. Let me give you a very specific example from my time at Patreon. Patreon is a creator membership platform. It is worth over $4 billion now. When I was there, I helped it go to $1 billion in annual GMV and over $100 million in revenue. At Patreon, for many, many years, we were crystal clear that our role in the creator ecosystem was to help creators monetize their fan base directly. In that world, if somebody could go from never having heard of a creator before to being a fan of that creator to then becoming their paying patron, then we wanted to tackle the fan to patron step. The first step in the journey, otherwise known as the zero to fan step, was something that we would absolutely not support. Why? Because there were plenty of companies out there with amazing discovery algorithms giving away creators content for free and paying them fractions of a penny from advertising dollars. We subscribe to a different theory, the 1,000 true fans concept, and we wanted to build the entire company and our entire product around that. Supporting the zero to fan step with the product would require a fundamentally different approach to the customer we sought, the products that we built, the markets we focused on, and our monetization model. By naming this distinction and saying that we specifically were not pursuing zero to fan in all of our strategies, company, product, growth, etc., we eliminated a lot of wasted time and energy. Because what happened was every time a new person joined the company, they had ideas. And many of those ideas were about the zero to fan phase. After all, that's where most consumers have lived and have experience. Places like YouTube or Instagram or TikTok. Because we were clear about where we operated, we were able to compartmentalize those ideas and not fixate on them. Now, because one of the most critical parts of a strategy are the omissions, I would like to offer you a few for the idea of strategy creation itself. First and foremost, strategy is not a detailed list of tactics. Strategy is not rigid. It can be revisited if it's not working well. It is not a hiring plan. It is the thing that informs that plan. It is not your OKRs. It helps you set them. It is not an exact timeline or a roadmap of delivery. It is not the vision. It's the building blocks that get you there. And finally, strategy is and should not be complicated. It should be easily communicated and understood. The process that gets you there can be complicated, but the strategy itself should not be. So why does strategy matter? To understand that, you need to be familiar with the two most common misconceptions about the strategy in the world of startups. First is that strategy is the purview of the executives at your company. And while it's true that sometimes executives go off and they do disconnected executive things, it is also true that the great strategy development is inclusive of a broader set of team members, those with deep context on your customers, your markets, and your industry. More on that when we get to creating the strategy. The second misconception is that strategy is a big company luxury, and therefore it doesn't matter to you. This assumption is flawed. A lot of those who hold on to this assumption assume that if you just run hard enough, you'll win the race. And while great execution does matter a lot, it is also true that you have to know what direction to run in if you want to reach the finish line. Otherwise, everyone lines up at the starting line for the relay, the race starts, and people sprint in all different directions and never get there. If you're working as an IC product manager, for example, you might make dozens of small, micro decisions every single day. Great execution means that you can make those decisions swiftly. But the speed and ease of that decision-making is enabled by a great, clear, well-understood product strategy. So that's all well and good, but how do we get there and what work is required? Great strategy sits at the intersection of intuition, customer knowledge, and market understanding. The thing about intuition is that it's mostly developed by having lots of reps at the problem you're working on, either directly or indirectly, through customer conversations and data. We call it intuition because it's really hard to describe all of the little conversations, the experiences, and the data points that all add up in our head. To illustrate this intersection, let's talk about two companies. First is Patreon. I already introduced what Patreon is. I had a very large hand in crafting the company strategy over the 4+ years that I was there. The elements of a great company strategy and the elements of Patreon's company strategy were the company ambition, our product offering, the audience we were targeting, why that audience would choose us, what we did that was really difficult to copy over a long period of time, and the major initiatives that supported the value creation for our customers and the company. At Patreon, our ambition was to establish Patreon as the world's best creator-first membership platform. And membership was defined as the offering that perfects the core of a creator delivering unique value to their patrons and thriving financially. So let's start with the customer part of our Venn diagram here. Our company goals were singularly focused on acquiring creators of a certain value and size. We learned over time through talking to customers and through observing our data that once a creator reached a certain threshold on our platform, their revenue retention or the net revenue churn was negative. Retention was over 100% on revenue. And those creators had an outsized impact on bringing other creators of very large size onto the Patreon platform simply by using it. Essentially, their presence was in itself viral. We also knew from research, there's that word again, that there were two primary reasons why someone became a patron. So this is the other customer on the platform. People became patrons to either support the creator or to receive unique value and benefits from their membership. We knew that support could happen anywhere, and it was something that made creators feel less successful or otherwise feel needy, and it would always exist on our platform regardless of whether we optimized for it. So we decided not to. Reducing the barrier to delivering unique value was a much more ambitious and challenging undertaking. Creators were excited about generating revenue from a value exchange with their patrons, but it also couldn't be too much work to do it or to maintain it at a big, big scale. So based on everything that we knew about all of our customers, both creators and patrons, we know that our strategy will have succeeded if we become the world's best creator-first membership platform. So from there, the next line of questioning becomes, if we want to be the world's best membership platform, what do creators need for that to happen? And this is where we now start to intersect customer knowledge with an understanding of the market. Through our company strategy, we developed the concept of the membership stack. And you might ask, how do we know that the membership stack was important? Well, it was because we studied both the creator as our customer and the markets that enabled them to solve some, but not all of their pain points. For example, creators needed our help converting fans to patrons, retaining those patrons, and increasing their value over time. This surfaced during the course of several years through observation of creator behavior, both on and off the platform. Creating a membership with tiers, benefits, and pricing is really, really hard, and creators tend to underprice their offering. Another key learning from our customers. At scale, continuing to maintain a robust membership program becomes a very cumbersome issue. Creators could become victims of their own success. Creators valued reliability and predictability of payments. We were their paycheck. And consistent value delivery was one of the keys to long-term patron retention. We would not know these things unless we spent significant time with our customers and understanding the markets that enabled them to do some of these things independently. And that, over time, became our strategy. Because of those large-scale problems that were focused on the membership stack, it naturally led to several very specific omissions or things we wouldn't do. For example, at the time, we decided that hosting audio and video content was not a key part of the membership stack, nor was developing or helping creators build that fan base or enabling developers to build on top of our data. These were all things that we had dabbled in the past. They had come up in conversation, but the focus of the membership stack helped us say no to these things. And I think it's also very interesting that several years later, and only very recently, did Patreon start to really adjust this strategy. They now do offer hosting of audio and video, as well as recently launched one-time commerce and community management for people who aren't patrons. But a lot of those things are actually just lead generation for membership, and it took years to get to that point. So I've covered at a high level company strategy. I want to talk a little bit about product strategy. And for that, I'm going to go to Imperfect Foods, which is now a part of Misfits Market. In order to skip product strategy, it's important for you to have in order to skip to product strategy, it's important for you to have some important context. The product vision was that we were going to be a first of its kind, effortless product experience that saves the planet in the process. Now, Imperfect Foods historically started out as a fruit and vegetable, ugly produce delivery service. We had gone through a COVID-fueled boom in grocery delivery and scaled the business 4x in revenue in 12 months, from $150 million to $600 million. As a result, we overinvested in scaling operations, marketing, and the food that we sold, the actual product itself. But the digital product investment had not kept pace with the new company we aimed to become. As a result, we had this as a problem. We had underinvested for so long that this was the problem that we had at the company level. It put a lot of pressure on the product organization. We wanted to be all things to all people immediately. So in order to focus and prioritize, I laid out our product strategy. The company strategy was very clear. Be the most sustainable way to buy food. Be the most affordable way to buy ugly produce and deliver the freshest product in the fastest time. But our product vision had to support this strategy. We wanted to deliver an effortless, recurring shopping experience that is intuitive and delightful from your first visit. Remember, if that's our vision, and if the vision is the moon, then the strategy is going to be, how do we get to that vision? In thinking through how to get there, I came up with 3 primary pillars for the business. The first was to nail the basics. The second was to increase flexibility. And the third was to personalize the experience. Now, there's nothing particularly earth-shattering about this strategy. And the dirty secret of most product strategies is that they're really not that earth-shattering. So how did I come up with these 3 strategic pillars? Let's go back to the intersection of intuition, customer knowledge, and market understanding. The first pillar, nailing the basics, was rooted in observation about customer expectations for a sustainable online grocery store and the key problems that our product failed to address. Our sign-up experience was confusing and non-standard. Product availability in what we sold wasn't obvious because of a CSA-style delivery approach that we had coalesced around since the founding of the company. Our shopping cart and our storefront were non-standard. And with a plan to expand to 1,000 shoppable SKUs as part of our company and merchandising strategy, it was only going to get worse. Search and discovery were almost non-existent. Showing related products or bundles was not possible. Everything that you would need from a full-service grocer didn't exist. The second pillar was about flexibility. Customers and the market expected us to be more like a grocery store. And that was the direction that we were headed as a company and operationally. But while we were the world's most flexible CSA box, we were simultaneously the most inflexible grocery store. And then third, after nailing the basics and increasing our flexibility, the final pillar and key differentiator came in taking advantage of our data network effects to deliver a fully personalized and mostly automated grocery experience. What this strategy did was twofold. First, it laid out a product experience that would first meet the expectations of our now quite large customer base. Second, it set us on a path for the post-COVID era by anticipating that those expectations would continue to rise when it was easier to return to the grocery store. I didn't expect that 2022 and beyond would look very much like 2021, and it turned out that I was right. So, because there was a never-ending stream of ideas from the rest of the leadership team, I also had to lean very heavily into the omissions, or the AntiG Goals, as we called them. Remember, one of the most important parts of the strategy is what you won't do. These were all things that the executives at our company were super excited about, but they fell outside of the product strategy. Nothing about nailing the basics said that we had to be at parity with other services. Nothing about flexibility said that we had to completely overhaul our subscription model. We didn't need technology to be at parity across both of our devices. We needed to match the customer need with the tool that they were using. We didn't want to revamp our third-party carrier model. That wasn't part of nailing the basics. It wasn't part of flexibility, and it wasn't part of personalization. And we didn't need to get to on-demand delivery because if you remember, we wanted to be the world's most sustainable grocer, and on-demand delivery wouldn't do that for us. So we covered a lot of ground very, very quickly in this discussion today, but I want to leave you with a couple of key takeaways on creating product strategy and some follow-ups that you can dig into deeper if you want to learn more about this in excruciating detail. There's only so much you can do in a single presentation. First, strategy is your plan to win. It needs to be memorable, specific, and measurable. The second thing, strategy operates at the intersection of intuition, customer knowledge, and market understanding. It takes time and repetition to master all three of those things. Third, strategy is a team sport. It doesn't matter if you're an executive or you're an IC. Even when you're in an execution-oriented role, it keeps you focused on running the right race. And that's what's most important. So, thank you very much for having me today. I super appreciate it. And let me tell you where you can learn more, going deeper than just a quick presentation on this stuff. If you're interested in following along, in reading more about this post that turned into this presentation, or working with me, you can find me at my website, adamfishman.com, my newsletter, fishmanafnewsletter.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's where I post most frequently. You can follow me on X at fishmanaf. And if you happen to be a parent or you are parenting curious, you can check out my podcast, startupdadpod.com. This newsletter that led to this presentation is one of the most popular things that I've written, and it goes deep into all of the components of both Patreon and Imperfect Foods strategy. I could only cover just a small sliver and slice of that here today. So with that, I will take a pause and we can go to questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam, for the incredible presentation. For those of you who are watching live, feel free to send over your questions now. I do have a couple of questions here to get us started with. The first being, so you spoke about company strategy at Patreon. Perhaps you want to elaborate more on that or another experience. Can you speak on where your approach to product and company strategy proved successful and what the key factors that contributed to its success were?
Sure. Where did it prove successful and the key factors that contributed to its success? Patreon is probably the best example of a company that has continued to grow and benefit from the company strategy that we laid out. So specifically at Patreon, the elements of that membership stack and the moving away from a support-oriented structure to a value exchange structure made all of the difference in the world. Moving to value exchange increased the retention of the creator-patron relationship. It helped creators make more money. It ultimately increased the virality of the platform because people wanted to talk about the things that they were offering versus just sort of come and support me. And so a key like orientation of that strategy was repositioning the entire company to be membership focused, changing how we talked about it in all of our communications, doing things like bolting on merchandise, which then eventually led to one-time commerce, which is what they have today. That was a really big one. Productionizing or templatizing the system of value that creators used, from benefits and tiers and pricing recommendations, and making that as turnkey and straightforward as possible, and making that sort of elements that they could easily add and remove and get guidance on. All of those things were long time streams of work that came out of the company strategy. And the business went from, a handful of millions of dollars when I got there to $1 billion in processed transactions on the platform over the course of only 3.5 or 4 years. And so that's a pretty significant validation of that strategy. The other thing that was a really good validation of that strategy is that over time, we saw the type of creator who was launching on the platform be bigger and bigger and bigger. And their sort of professionalism increased drastically, because what they were looking for was not a support platform. It was not Kickstarter V2 or recurring Kickstarter. It was membership. It was premium. It was exclusive. And so what we saw was bigger and bigger creators with teams, small media companies, things like that launching on Patreon. And a lot of that was because of the capabilities that we built based off of the company and then subsequently the product strategy. And that is that membership stack. So I think the proof is in the value creation that has happened at that company. Now, of course, they're at several years removed from that time, and their strategy has clearly evolved, right? They are doing some of the things that we said were anti-goals at the time, which is totally fine and acceptable. I think they probably realized that if they needed to grow even more, you had to start addressing some of these adjacent use cases. And so now is the time to do that after having done all of the other things under the membership stack. So that is my take on that question.
Awesome. Great insights. So this next question here might relate more to your time with Imperfect Foods and your anticipation of the market changes there. So in your framework for strategy creation, how do you address this balance between the short-term goals and the long-term vision? And what are the specific considerations or methods that you find particularly effective in maintaining this balance?
Yeah, great question. Balancing short and long term is always challenging. I think, though, that what strategy is comprised of is typically a series of bets and a series of initiatives. And the reality is that a bet is not typically a small undertaking. But what you have to do from there to get to the short term is take the work from your strategy and break it down into smaller and smaller component parts. So let's take our moon analogy for example. If the moon is the vision and the ladder is the strategy that gets us there, then a piece of that strategy becomes an individual team's moon, right? So let's say it's around nailing the basics. Well, what is the vision for what the basics are comprised of? And then from there, you can break that down further and say, well, here's how we know if we are nailing the basics. What are the 1, 2, and 3 steps that we put in front of ourselves? So you go from strategy down into roadmap, and roadmap is very, very clear and very prescriptive for a shorter period of time. I'm not talking about like a sprint. I'm talking about a quarter or a half of a year or something like that. So if you start at this sort of high level, broad 3 to 5 year outlook, and then your product strategy is maybe a 3-year outlook, and then your roadmap is a component of that strategy that is a 6 to 12-month outlook. Eventually, you can break things down into finer and finer grain detail and get to a point where everything is very small and achievable and can be done inside of a sprint. And it gives you that kind of course correction on whether or not you're actually working on the right stuff and the strategy is correct. The way to do that is to make smaller and smaller bets that ladder up to that thing that you want to achieve. And so you're constantly reevaluating, maybe every 6 months. Are we working on the right stuff? What have our bets told us and the experiments underlying those bets? And should we make a change here? And so when you think about something like planning for next year, you can have thematically an idea of the types of bets that you want to make, because in order to get to where you want to be in 2026, you need to lay some of that groundwork in 2024. But you may not very likely get through 2024 working on all of the same stuff that you thought you were going to work on when the year started. And so that's that process of kind of reevaluating continuously and recalibrating using the near term to understand whether you're on the right long-term trajectory. So hopefully that is helpful for folks on the call.
Absolutely. So we had another question come in here saying, you said that strategy is not a timeline, but since you have these steps, this implies that do we still need some sort of timeline?
That's a great question. And I realize that maybe there's a little bit of like counterintuitiveness there. Timeline is really more about sequencing the order in which you will tackle something. It is less about we are going to do this in week 1 and this in week 2 and this in week 3. Let me give you a specific example. At Resort Pass, where I was most recently the interim CPTO, we have a 3-year product strategy. Underlying that is basically two parts to the business, the marketplace and the hotel side. Each of those has 3 main pillars. And in each of those pillars, we have a priority of when we believe we will work on it. And so in year 1, we have most of our energy and effort focused on pillar 1, with some of our energy and effort starting to look at pillar 2. Maybe that comes in the second half of the year because we're doing discovery and research and learning. Then as you move into year 2, assuming the work is done, we expect that we will pull priority 2 into the pole position, and that will be our primary focus in year 2. And year 3 priority becomes sort of the secondary focus in year 2. And then we roll that forward and we work on year 3 stuff becomes the number 1 priority again. Now, again, you're just giving a high level map of we think that we will tackle these themes in this order. It's very likely that you can learn something that causes you to want to do that differently, but you give people kind of a annualized look at thematic groupings of your product strategy pillars. And that gives people a sense of like, oh, I know that this is a thing that we have talked about. And yet I can see that this other theme is actually quite a bit more important. The other thing that you can do then with your product strategy and your sequencing is you can use that as a means to growing the team. So for example, if your leadership is not satisfied with that kind of sequencing, you can always pull things in earlier, but it comes with a yes and. You can't do too much stuff at once within one team because it is unfocused and you end up with that like random sprinting relay race GIF. So the key then is to say, well, if we want to split focus, we probably actually don't want to do that. We probably want to have another team working on this to validate that this is a opportunity and to get us working on it sooner. And if we can do that, then we should fund it. And funding it means more people. Now, typically, I think at a company level, you can really only pull off a handful of big bets every year. And that's because it requires company-wide people from every team leaning in on a set of initiatives. The same is true in product, but you can have multiple product teams and things like that. And so I guess that's a long answer to the short question of how do you show sequencing and timeline? I very rarely show it in we will absolutely be starting on this at this point in time. I use broader bounding boxes to say, I think next year, this is the focus. I think the year after, this is the focus. And the year after that, this is the focus. And halfway through the year, we'll revisit and we'll see what we've learned. And we'll make a call as to whether this still seems like the right approach. I think one of the issues that companies run into is they typically don't devote enough time to figuring out if something is the right approach. And they kind of abandon ship and move on to the nice, shiny new thing because, again, it feels good to work on a new thing. So I caution people against spreading themselves too thin and trying to pull in too much, because you're better being thorough than maybe letting 1,000 flowers bloom.
So I think this next question really goes hand in hand with this discussion of how much are we having this timeline in place. So how do you recommend leaders navigate unexpected challenges or disruptions while still staying true to their strategic goals?
Yeah, great question. I mean, one is you will always have unexpected challenges or disruptions. Like that is just a fact of life. If you are building a startup, if you are in a fast growing company, something is always going to come up and it's going to feel like it's super important. I think the question that you should ask yourself is, how critical is this thing relative to work that we should be doing on the strategy? The strategy is the thing that is going to create long-term value for your customers and your company. And over time, that's the thing that's going to make your product more defensible and durable and grow your customer base. If something comes up that feels very important, ask yourself why that feels so important. Is it going to grow your customer base? Is it going to create more value? Is it going to destroy value if it's not fixed? And so that is definitely a thing that has to be factored in. The other thing is the strategy isn't the only set of stuff that you will ever work on. You will always have to allocate some amount of team time to running the business and keeping the lights on. And that's the place that stuff typically tends to go wrong or go sideways, is the day-to-day like running of the business. Ideally, you create a balance where you're not spending 100% of your time just running the business, and you can actually work on things that are creating long-term value, because you'll never get there if you don't. And so my pushback to folks is always to remind them when something comes up, it is typically from a stakeholder. And I like to remind them, here is the strategy that we all agreed was really important to the long-term success of this business. Is this other thing now more important than the long-term success of the business and these other elements? And if so, what changed? Why do we believe that? And if not, can we go without solving this problem? And sometimes the answer is actually yes. Or is there a non-product solution to solving this problem? Also, sometimes the answer is yes. Now, of course, if your site is tipping over and people can't actually use your product, well, that's a different story. But that doesn't happen that much unless you've built a pretty shaky architecture and infrastructure. So that's my take on that.
All right. So the next question we have here says, you emphasized strategy being a team sport. How do you ensure that the strategy is effectively communicated and understood throughout the entire organization?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question, because in my post, I talk about why this is one of the most important things that you can do. I have a principle in product that I expect for myself, and I expect every one of the PMs on my team to adhere to. It's kind of a baseline expectation. And that is over communicate until everyone gets it, and then communicate some more. And so I think the common mistake that folks make when it comes to communicating product strategy is they get up in front of the company, they go into the all hands, and they go, here it is. And they walk through it, and then you never hear from them again. And so one of the things, the reason that I say it is a team sport is because you are constantly reiterating your product strategy and explaining it to people. And in every conversation, anytime a product manager is talking about a feature, they are laddering that up to, and remember, this maps to the strategy that we all agreed on, which says X. So you, the product executive or product leader, cannot be the only person that is championing your strategy. You need your team to do it. You need other executives to do it. You need the leaders and the rest of the company to do it. Everyone down to like the customer support person should understand, why are we building what we're building? And so it's kind of like the laddering that you see within OKRs. You are always laddering down and then laddering back up in your communication to continue to connect people with that strategy. Another example that where we did this was, we actually at Patreon started every company meeting with the main slide that was there for the kind of waiting room or whatever, was the pillars of our company strategy. And we reminded people at the start of every single all hands meeting. It was just always there. So that's sort of one thing. The other thing that we did was we actually surveyed people. We surveyed people internally, and we said, what are the elements of the company strategy? What are the elements of the product strategy? And we had people respond to a survey, and we got an understanding of whether or not they actually remembered them, understood them, and things like that. And we did that at various intervals throughout the year. And so that was another thing. Third thing that we did was, anytime a new person joined the company, they got an overview of the company strategy. Sometime it was in a group session, sometimes it was one-on-one, sometimes it was expected that their manager would do it. But every new person is potentially a chink in the armor of the memory hole. And you have to make sure that as part of your onboarding, it's not just, where is the bathroom and how do I log into Slack? But it's also, what are the things that matter to this company? That could be values. It is definitely the strategy. Why are we here to do what we're doing every day? And why does it matter? And so those are like several touch points that you want to have, but you have to build it into every interaction with folks on your team, including quizzing your own product managers on the strategy and asking them why something that they're working on matters, and getting their answer from that. So that's how I've done it. There's just a couple examples of how I've done it, but you will always think that people understand the strategy better than they actually do. And you will understand it better than everyone else because you created it. And so it's your job to make sure that everyone is doing their part to reiterate and communicate the strategy in all the conversations that they have.
So this next question is along the same lines, but if you have anything else to add, how do you foster a collaborative culture within a company to ensure this alignment?
Wonderful question. I will give you an example of how we are doing that right now at Resort Pass with planning some of our bigger initiatives for the upcoming couple of years. One is, as a business, we believe that the majority of our energy and effort should still be focused on the core. So there aren't that many big bets and net new product things that we feel like we are urgently needing to create. And so right then and there, we are saying what is important is realizing a very high ceiling that we think we have within the product. And here are all of the reasons that this ceiling is there and how we can get there, with a very specific focus on the core. Second thing that we did as a leadership team and as getting input from the rest of our team members is we put forward a set of initiatives that we think have real, over time, market changing potential for the business. And a lot of that comes, again, rooted in customer conversation, market understanding, studying the competitive and dynamic and alternatives, how other companies that don't even really do what Resort Pass is doing, but operate in a somewhat similar space, how they're handling things, et cetera. Feedback from our customers, feedback from hotels, things like that. And so that's crystallized in like a handful, maybe 7, maybe it started off as 12 kind of big bets that we think we could make in the coming years. And then we actually sized those based on a rough understanding of what it might look like to go take those on. And then at the executive level, we debated the sizing and we asked people to kind of defend, one, stack rank, and then 2, defend or disagree on the different kind of rankings and positions that we gave things. And so that is like actually really helpful in driving alignment, because you get out all of the pros and cons of various initiatives and you uncover a lot of sort of unknowns. Because it's possible that you think a particular body of work or a particular initiative is super important. Your marketing counterpart maybe doesn't. Maybe there's a bunch of hidden work, or maybe there's a way for the marketing team to kind of test something out and do discovery before any kind of real investment is made there. And so it's that debate and sizing and discussion that really leads to driving alignment. Now, sometimes people are just fundamentally at odds with one another, in which case you kind of have to dig deeper to understand, like, why does this person, what about their lived experience makes this particular executive or team member feel that this is very important? What data do they have that I don't have, and vice versa? And so you have to get that out on the table to really kind of understand what's at the root of somebody's belief. And then, of course, as many folks know, like, there is a point where if you can't get to agreement, you have to get to a point of disagreeing and committing to things. Now, if everything that you do is a disagree and commit, that is a problem. That's probably a cultural problem more than it is like a strategy problem. But a handful of these things are going to end up being disagree and commit. And so basically what we did at Resort Pass is we started with a list of sort of 12 macro things. We cut that down to 7 because there were some things we just didn't think made sense given the kind of business that we want to be. And then we further cut that down to like maybe only 1 or 2 initiatives that are worth exploring as we go into next year. And then what we said was, when we explore some of these things, that will give us signal as to whether we should more aggressively pursue them in the coming years. Like, one example that I'll give you is international expansion. Originally, there's a lot of enthusiasm about international expansion. But when you think about profiting from the core, and how much work and potential there is right here in front of us, it begs the question of like, why add the complexity of international expansion? Look at the market dynamics that are happening internationally, look at the competitive landscape, look at the companies that we've talked to that operate internationally. It's a distraction to try to make a huge investment in that in the next year, for example. And we all got into alignment on that because we're all in agreement that the core is important. And this is tangential from the core right now. So that's one example. But debate and discussion and like messiness is what drives alignment.
Absolutely. So our next question here says, can you talk about the differing values of both UX research and market research when it comes to developing product strategy?
Sure. I would say so I actually would further kind of classify this. I think there are a handful of different types of research. Market research is understanding things like what is the opportunity in a particular customer segment or a particular geography or location, or with a particular kind of like ICP or something like that. That's sort of one form of research. That tends to be more longer looking. So that's like, hey, we think international expansion is a big opportunity for us, but we don't know. So let's go size that market and let's kind of understand how customers in Western Europe think about Resort Pass versus, or the concept of Resort Pass versus the US. That's kind of like market research. There is another thing that I find really valuable in doing product strategy, which is what I would call generative research, which is generative research is when you don't really yet know the questions you need to be asking and you want to explore an area. So generative research might be something like we did at Patreon around merchandise, which is we loosely know that creators like the idea of selling merchandise, but we don't really know what shape that could take in our product. So let's go understand merchandise broadly. We're not going to build it tomorrow. We might actually not build very much, but we need to kind of understand that space. And that is what I would define as sort of like more generative research, which is a lot of what strategy sort of drives you towards, is doing some of that generative research and longer looking stuff. UX research, or user experience research, is much more rooted in how people are using the product, prototyping, getting feedback on stuff that you are building or very imminently considering building. It is much more solution testing in my mind than it is like, what does the merchandise landscape look like? It might be, which version of our product detail page is going to make the most sense to customers. And so I think you use more UX research to steer the ship week to week. It is more design oriented, things like that. I think you use generative research to shape the longer term view of the different areas and opportunities that you want to explore, and so on. And I think you use market research to think about even bigger picture things, new customer segments, new geographies, et cetera. And so that's kind of how I would break that down. When it comes to strategy, you're probably living more in the generative research and the market research phase of things. When it comes to running a sprint, building a feature, you are probably more in the UX research and maybe a little bit of the generative research to understand the problem area.
All right, so we have time for just a couple more questions here before we close.
Sure.
So you mentioned revisiting strategy halfway through the year. How frequently do you suggest revisiting and potentially adjusting the strategic framework in order to respond to market changes?
Yeah, that is a good question. Um, the way that I have typically, so again, I mentioned I think companies typically don't stay with a strategy long enough. I think they tend to throw it out and move on. I think that is very risky because oftentimes it takes a while to figure out if something is working or not. The couple of signals that I use to start to give me some idea of whether we're heading in the right direction is um, things like a monthly business review or a quarterly business review, where we look at the initiatives we're working on and we look at the outcome and the sort of the output of those initiatives and the traction that we're getting with some of our investments. And I'm not talking about traction like, did this A/B test, move conversion by 0.7% or something like that. I'm talking about like things that we're learning and discovery, um, things that we thought we had high conviction on, but seem to be not going so well. And so usually if you see a repeated pattern in like a monthly or quarterly business review, it means that there's something to dig into further. And it might mean, reviewing the either that initiative or that particular piece of the strategy or something like that. I don't like to rethink, like entirely reimagine a company strategy on a half yearly basis. One, it's time consuming. Two, it's hugely disruptive to the business. I would rather spend a little bit more time up front to build more conviction and then go forward. And you're maybe like adjusting on a half yearly basis. You might say, hey, we're learning that this thing may not be as important. So let's change some sequencing and stuff like that. But if you're constantly revisiting everything and jerking the team around, like that is a cascading whiplash effect. And you may be able to come to terms with it quickly as the leader, but the rest of the team is going to scramble for a while, and reforming around a new strategy is going to take them time. So if you're changing it constantly in big swings, hugely disruptive. It's unproductive for your team. They're not going to have enough time to actually see their work through. So at a maximum, I think doing some big revisiting one time a year and then reevaluating on an annualized basis, great. Obviously monitoring progress in a monthly or quarterly business review to understand if the components of an initiative are bearing fruit, not bearing fruit, things like that. But that's about it. I don't think like you're not revisiting stuff sprint to sprint. This stuff really takes like, at a minimum, usually a quarter of discovery and testing and stuff like that to kind of figure out if there's any green shoots. And so changing more frequently, which by the way, I know companies do, and those companies struggle. So I would not recommend it.
All right, really quickly, we just have one more question here. And it says, considering the fast pace of technological advancements, how can product leaders accommodate innovation in the integration of these new technologies into their company's overall strategic plan?
Great question. I think there are only sort of a handful of major like platform shifts that fundamentally alter the landscape of a company. We may be going through one right now with AI, although I haven't seen anything remarkable that AI has done for a product other than, like writing and Copilot and things like that, which is like, okay, cool. The last major platform shift we had was probably mobile. That was years ago. Like, when did the iPhone come out? I don't know, 2007, something like that. So like it's been a long time since we've had a big platform shift. The other stuff, like, I don't know, name some other really big swing platform changes that are going to fundamentally disrupt a bunch of businesses. At least in the consumer space, I don't think you can. I mean, there's certainly in the like world of B2B SaaS, there are things like product-led growth, stuff like that are becoming more popularized, but they've actually been around for a long time. They just have a new label. And so if you notice something, so like, let me give you AI as an example. If you think that large language models and generative AI truly can transform the product that you are selling to customers and the experience, then you should absolutely figure out how that changes your strategy. But there are probably a lot of businesses where it's not really going to make a bit of difference. And so I think you just have to look at how people are using it, how you think it could change the customer experience. Are there competitors emerging that are taking advantage of this new technology? And if all of those things are true, if you have really obvious and strong insight that a new platform or new technology is really going to transform your business, then yeah, absolutely. It's time to rethink the strategy, and at least incorporate that and probably demote something else. But I just don't think that comes around that often. So aside from, mobile and AI, like I can't think about something that would happen in a typical year. The only other exception being something like COVID. COVID caused a lot of companies to have to go, oh crap, our business simply doesn't exist anymore because of COVID. Take something like Eventbrite and ticketing and stuff like that. I mean, they had to fundamentally rethink their strategy immediately because their platform dropped 95% of its value overnight. And so that is a thing where like, ooh, there is a real market factor at play here, or the case of Imperfect Foods. There's a real market factor at play here that is well beyond anyone's control, that is causing us to need to fundamentally change how our business operates. But that stuff doesn't happen that often. So you should be on the lookout for it, but I'd be surprised if you're getting like 3 of those a year. It's just not happening.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for the wonderful presentation and for taking the time to answer questions from our community today. This was incredibly insightful. And thank you as well to those of you who joined us live today. This will be going live on our YouTube channel and on our website this Friday. We will send out a link to the recording to all of you so that you can rewatch and share with colleagues. So we hope to see you next time.
Thanks for having me, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.